One could argue that the large bastions of global communications, globalized communications, are ones which push a sort of secularized, individualized view of the world. Now that is a threat, but you know what? It's also an opportunity, because it's an opportunity for cultures which are, let's say, more traditional, more family-oriented, to say, well, you know what? Instead of complaining about globalization, let's actually use globalization to fight back and push our view of the world.
A related concern about globalization is its effect on indigenous cultures.
I mean, even if we grant that global competitive markets create prosperity, is it worth the fast food chains and the big box stores that we see everywhere we go? And what about a sense of vulgarity and bringing things to the lowest common denominator? And perhaps most important, does globalization destroy local culture?
I mean, the question of globalization, I mean, obviously it can destroy local cultures. I mean, there's simply no question about that. And it can create an unfortunate homogeneity. As you go around to various countries around the world, you're discovering they're becoming more and more similar. At the same time, as people see that happening, they often, react by trying to say, hang on, what here is actually worth holding on to? And so it can actually lead to a resurgence of some traditional forms of identity.
So the Irish language has grown, has been taught in private schools actually across most of this part of Ireland, where maybe the language had been lost for 3 or 4 generations are sending their children to be educated into the Irish language. Irish music, traditional dance, you've seen the river dance phenomenon all over the world. That's Irish culture.
In Ireland, we've actually used globalization to sell our culture around the rest of the world. So you've got great Irish rock bands like U2, you've obviously got Guinness, and you've got Irish culture, poetry and film. And that shows how a small country can use globalization to huge success.
This also happens in developing countries. Just think of all the products that you can find from Africa, Latin America, Asia, whenever you go to a store in the US or Europe.
Many of these countries are also finding ways to hold on to aspects of their culture that they value. For instance,
there's an interesting study by UNESCO on music in Ghana. And even though they had access, to music from the US and Europe, over 70% of their music was bought and produced locally. So most of the music that they're actually listening to is produced in Ghana.
Man cannot live by bread alone. It's very important that developing countries do not see the global market and the opportunities of a global market as a substitute for their native culture and values. It's extremely important to know who you are and what your culture is. But it's also, in a strange kind of way, it's what gives you what David Ricardo called the comparative advantage. It gives you that unique selling point that you have on world markets.